So, this is our first video concerning ecology. Ecology is a study of interactions. So we're going to be looking at the interactions that organisms have with each other and with their environment. The first thing that you need to know are the levels of interaction. So there are multiple levels of interaction. The first is with the individual. The individual is a single organism and how it behaves. Generally, when we study the individual level of interaction, we track an organism from birth to death, and we look at all of the ways it interacts with its environment. The next one is the population. So a population is all of the organisms of that same species living in that area. So this would be a single herd of what we see here, which is elk. And we would track how that population of elk interacts with their environment. Next, we have the community. The community is all of the living things in an area. So that would be all the predators, all the other organisms that compete for the food sources in that area, all the plants living in that area. All of those things are part of the community. Those are the living aspects of the area. The ecosystem is a little bit broader. The ecosystem also includes all the abiotic factors, all the non-living things in an area. So that would be the water availability, the terrain, the weather, all those abiotic factors. Another thing to consider with abiotic factors would be something like the soil content of that area. The next level of interaction is the biome. The biome is all of the areas that look the same as the ecosystem for that climate. So they all share a common climate. So a biome would be something that has all the same climate and all the same ecosystem aspects, but over a large area. And then finally, we have the biosphere. The biosphere is the next level of interaction. And what we're looking at here is how all the different biomes interact together and how all of them influence each other to create what we see on our planet. So I used a couple of terms that you may not be familiar with, so I want to clear those up now. Abiotic are the non-living things in an ecosystem. So weather, like rain, would be an abiotic factor. Soil content is another, water availability is another, temperature, all of those things go into abiotic factors. Another term I used, biotic, are living factors. So these are all the living things in an area. We consider those biotic. Another term that we need to consider when we're looking at the interactions of organisms in an area is biodiversity. Biodiversity is all the different animals living in an area. So a biodiverse or a really diverse ecosystem is one that has a really high biodiversity. And if we look here, we can see lots of different species in this example picture. We have lots of different types of fish. We have lots of different types of corals. We may even have lots of different types of bacteria. Lots of biodiversity here. And one of the things that we're realizing is that lots of ecosystems have a lot of biodiversity that we just have taken for granted. Like we didn't really understand the interactions of bacteria in an ecosystem before. And so we didn't really consider them as part of the biodiversity of an ecosystem until recently. And we're really starting to realize that biodiversity is a huge key to just how healthy an environment is, how healthy an ecosystem is. If you have lots of different organisms living in an area, you have lots of different competition, you really start to see just how healthy that ecosystem is. And when we start to see drops in biodiversity, where we have maybe just one or two species dominating an area, we really start to see a really weak ecosystem that doesn't have a lot of capability of adapting as the environment changes. So Couple of other vocab terms that you need to be aware of and how they influence how organisms interact. Habitat is where an organism lives. A niche is what an organism does. So in a given environment, in a given ecosystem, organisms probably share that as a habitat, but they usually do not share a niche. They don't share what they do. You usually have one pollinator or maybe a couple of different pollinators for specific plants where they have a symbiotic relationship or a combined relationship where that pollinator is unique to that plant. But an all over pollinator, something like a hummingbird, you might only have one species living in a given habitat. Same thing with a top predator like a polar bear. You probably don't have multiple top predators living in an area. That is a niche that is usually filled by one species. That species is usually considered the keystone species. So a keystone species is a unique and very important species to a given ecosystem. And it gets its name from this stone right here in this arch. This is called the keystone. If you remove this stone, the arch collapses in on itself. The keystone really is the one that holds the arch together. So a keystone species is the species that holds the ecosystem together. Sometimes it's a top predator, like we see with wolves. In the case of the Yellowstone ecosystem, they are the keystone species that all other organisms rely on to be present. Or it could be something like a beaver, where a beaver really makes the environment that other species rely on. Then we come to ecological equivalents. Ecological equivalents are species that do the same thing, but they live in different habitats. So my example of ecological equivalents here are an echidna and an anteater. Both of them are insectivores, which means they eat insects. So they really reduce the amount of insects in a given habitat, but they live in completely different areas of the world. The echidna is native to Australia and the surrounding islands, whereas the anteater is really native to Africa. Doing the same job, filling the same niche, living in different habitats. That's what ecological equivalents are. And that's where we're going to end today. Just a lot of refresher on some basic terminology and basic interactions that we see in ecology.